fact that this reading that you've heard today, or this is being re-recorded because of a glitch in our technical situation. The readings from Matthew 21:33 through 46 was read by Connie Kreitz. I'm not sure whether it'll be on here before, but I'm not going to take the time to reread it. For those of you at home, I would encourage you to read this parable of the vineyard. The last time I talked about another parable of a vineyard, and you think in a world like ours, with a pandemic sweeping across it, the idea of looking out across the beautiful Napa Valley or from Valhalla up on the hill here in Roanoke, where you could see a great scene of downtown Roanoke, or even the vineyard up on the Blue Ridge Parkway, it would be peaceful and wonderful to sit there and look out across the grapes growing on the hills. However, this is not the case in this particular parable or about this particular vineyard. Just before this parable, up in verse 28, Jesus told the story of a man who had two sons. He said to one, "Go and work in the vineyard today." He said, "I will not." But then he changed his mind and went. He said to his other son, "Go to the vineyard today and work." And the son said, "I will," but did not. And then Jesus says, in the very same breath almost, listen to another parable. Remember, he's talking here to the Jewish leaders and Pharisees, the people who kind of ruled the business of the day. And from him saying, listen to another parable, we get the idea that Jesus has vineyards on his mind, because he told the parable of the tenants who were hired, then the vineyard story about the two sons, and now he tells this story. These are all very in close approximation in the Gospel of Matthew. He tells us about a vineyard owner who, after he gets his vineyard set up, takes off on vacation to Aruba or some beach along the Indian Ocean or whatever, but he takes off for a while. He's an absentee, a landlord. When the vineyard comes to harvest, the vineyard owner sends his servants or his collectors in to collect whatever his due was, whether it was grapes or whatever, but he was to collect his part. Matthew tells us they were twice beaten and sent home without the rent or without whatever they were supposed to get. The vineyard owner then sends his son to collect the rent, thinking the vineyard owner says they'll surely respect my son. He's the heir to the estate. But they don't react the way he suspected that they would, and they kill the son. Now, as you know, and you can look at just about every commentary, this parable is taken to be an allegory. I've looked at several of them, and I didn't find one that's going to say what I'm going to say to you today. In the allegory, God is the owner of the vineyard. And by the way, the word vineyard is very often in the Old Testament described as God's kingdom. And this study that we're doing today, and the thing that we talked about the week before, should indicate to us that there are words in the Old Testament and usage in the Old Testament that do not carry forward because of what changes in society or the situation itself. In the general understanding of this, God's the owner of the vineyard, the tenants are the Jewish leaders, and the son is Jesus. It's referred to nearly all of the time as the parable of the wicked tenants. But if you remember what I said the last time I spoke about this, the vineyard owner and the workers that were hired at various times during the day, this parable too needs for us to look at it again. And it's a look that doesn't rely on interpreting it as an allegory, but as the real relationship between owners and workers in the land of Jesus in that particular day. Remember, landowners and vineyards are nearly always negative. Landowners are not well liked. And we talked about that in more length in the other sermon. A landowner, if you'll follow with me for a while, in most of these stories, and in this one, I believe, is actually the villain of the story. And I know this kind of sounds outrageous because I know what you believe and what I've even believed and taught about this particular parable. So let's begin with some information that we have from the story and what we learned when we talked about the other vineyard, and I may reflect back on that for those of you who weren't here. First, the owner is an absentee landowner. And that's a condition of which Jesus' hearers would be very familiar. But keep in mind, if God is the landowner, do we think of God as being absentee? That really doesn't sound very much like God. Absentee landowners existed by using tenant farmers. And again, you'll read about those who were hired. They were given a day's wage, 1 day's wage, which meant they had to come back day after day. Scholar Richard Horsley points out that most tenant farmers had lost their ancestral land to those landowners due to having bad years where they had to sell land because land was money. So they sold off their land so they could exist. And so the landowners have gradually taken control over the economy, and the landowners have the power in the society at that time. Another scholar, Wink Herzog, says because the lands were intentionally cultivated for food, land on which to build a vineyard was usually land taken from somebody else. And when you took land, you didn't take the worst of it, you took the best of it, and that's what you needed for vineyards. And that taking would have been through foreclosure on loans to the poor. And as I said, those who had a bad year or whatever they might have needed money for, which was land, and they therefore sold their land. It might help if we remembered the Old Testament story of King Ahab, and he looked out from his palace and saw this beautiful vineyard owned by a man by the name of Naboth, which indicates that Naboth was well off. He was not a peasant, and so King Ahab made him an offer he thought he couldn't refuse, and he refused to sell the land. By the way, he could not by the law sell his land. Land given by God to the Hebrews was to be kept forever. It was never to be sold, period. This incident, by the way, caused Ahab and Jezebel to have a run-in with the prophet Elijah. In the story, Ahab's wife Jezebel had Naboth framed by various means so that Ahab could finally get the valued land, but he didn't hold it very long, as I said. Now the teaching in the land was that God owned all of the land, and therefore God was involved in the distribution of the land. And as you know, when they entered the promised land, every family of every tribe received a portion of the land. And as I said again, I underline this, it was to be kept forever. So when land was lost, and you read about tenant farmers, it was almost lost due to indebtedness. Most of the time, original owners could lose all of their land, but the landowner would allow them to live on the land and become tenant farmers. But according to Jewish law, every 50th year, according to the law, the land was to be returned to its rightful owner. Now, there's some discussion about how effectively that was done after the Babylonian captivity. I really didn't research the timeline of the Jubilee years as far as it was kept. But however, it was the law, and there's no indication that it wasn't still being kept to some degree in the time of Christ. The landowner would have to give back the land to the original family, which in a way meant that the family could still be connected to the land that God had given them. It's kind of a social safety net. It would be theirs forever. But as apparently, if they would go in debt again, which was very often the way that the landowners dealt with them, they would have to give it up again. As I said before, don't think when Jesus talks about these people that he's talking about people of virtue. This is the world as it was in the day of Christ. Now, the rich had two primary ways to extend their wealth, namely by plundering the land and the tenants through various forms of deceit and forced labor, and they could incorporate the tenants and their land into their very own estate, with the tenants living on the land they once owned and now working for the landowner. The peasants were relatively powerless in that time. They had very little power, and the powerful could take as much as they wanted without much repercussion. As I said before, Jesus' hearers would have been disposed before the landowner. They would have been, again, let me say this, they are listening to Jesus and they hear this parable. They would be sympathetic to the tenants in the story, because the tenants were just trying to rectify an unjust situation over the land that they had been cheated out of with no ability to get it back. So keep in mind, whenever you read Jesus talk about a landowner and tenants, it's usually the tenants who are the heroes and the landowner who's the villain. A vineyard was a wealthy man's way of wasting good land that was once owned by people who needed it to grow food for their families. Now, you will notice in this particular story, which is he says parable, that this landowner has put a fence or a wall around his vineyard and put a tower in it, and of course dug a wine press there in it. Why? If the Romans wanted to enter that vineyard and steal the grapes, they could do it. Wouldn't have been anything to stop them. This is a way of saying to the original owners, you will never get your land back. This is mine now, and I will guard it with everything that I have. Forget it. Never be yours again. So Jesus sets up here a narrative where the peasants are once again, as they often were, backed into a corner by an owner who cares nothing about them, but only about getting himself more wealth and more riches. Now, the way the story starts, as I said, is intended to be linked to the previous one about the two brothers. So we know that this parable is about another vineyard. It's also directed, as the other one was, toward the temple brokers, who were supposed to be the stewards of the law, who had developed a system by which they could keep the poor poor and the rich richer. This story, after the harvest, the owner, as you remember, sends his collectors in for the rent, and they're beaten up by the tenants and sent packing. Now, for Jesus' hearers, it would be hard for them to have any sympathy for the owner's loss. In their mind, he had it coming. So more leg breakers are sent in, and they're beaten up as well. So what's he going to do? He knows he can't let this slide. He knows that you cannot not collect rent from people who are on your property. He knows if that gets out, other landowners will say, now we're going to have problems because you didn't enforce it. He knows he has to come down on them very hard. Now here's where Jesus sticks in the unexpected twist into the story. Now, instead of sending in more muscle or getting other landowners to help him go collect what is his, the owner sends his son. And it's this final act of arrogance that sends the tenants into a fury. See, by sending his own son, he sends the one who will inherit the land. By sending his own son, he's saying, I own it, my son will own it, and his son may will own it too. It will never be yours again, so forget it. He rubs their noses in the fact that they've lost. They're losers. This act says to the tenants, this is mine now. Be mine forever. My son and his son will own it. And I'm sending him because I know you don't dare lay a finger on him because we're untouchable. Now, this way of reading the story, I think makes sense of the crucial part of the story where the tenants say this, here comes the son. If we kill him, we'll get back our inheritance. In the traditional thinking of the story, that wouldn't make any sense. Wouldn't these landowners, even though they lived these peasants, even though they lived in a different world, surely know that killing the owner's son would not make them get their land back? And these lines really make no sense if the vineyard owner is supposed to be God. And the tenants are supposed to be the Jewish leaders and the son Jesus. They didn't know Jesus was the Lord. They heard he was going to try to be Messiah, that he was messing things up. But Paul said that they would have known who he was, they would have not have crucified him. But if the tenants are the original landowners of the land, and they believe that killing the son will take away all the heirs, then they might get their land back. What we're seeing here is, I think, the possibility of a peasant revolt. The tenants are going to get their land back, even if they have to use violence to get it. Let me pause for a minute, reset it, and decide who's supposed to be the bad guy in this story. The bad guys are supposed to be the Jewish leaders. We're told that at the end that they wanted to kill Jesus because of this particular parable. But the way the story is traditionally told, the Jewish leaders are supposed to be the tenants. But in this reading of the story, the Jewish leaders are the elite who represent absentee landowners who rob peasants year after year still keep putting their foot on their necks by collecting a tithe from them each Sabbath day. I know you may be saying, Keith, that's a stretch. You seem to be sounding like Jesus is advocating a violent revolt and a rebellion, a revolt that could end up in bloodshed. And I would say that's a fair point to ask. Jesus is not advocating violent overthrow. I think Jesus here is speaking as a prophet, and we're told at the end that they determined that he was a prophet in what he said, which I think is to say, this is what you people who stole this land, who are abusing these people, have to look forward to. If you keep treating people this way, don't be surprised when something like this happens. And we've seen throughout history that peasants, once they've been pushed too far, do revolt. Now, according to Wink Herzog's study, the peasants' violent outburst is their way of reasserting their honorable status as the heirs of a shameful act of those who have taken their land and will not give it back. The ruling elite proclaim themselves the rightful heirs. The rebellious peasants are considered to be outlaws. I do not think, as I said, that Jesus is making excuses for violent and destructive behavior. But we know throughout history what happens when people are pushed too far, when they can't take it anymore. And remember, as I said before, we're not talking about those folks that go to Sunday school every day. We're talking about normal, everyday people, just like we have everyday people in this world and in all the nations of the earth. And when they become hopeless and pushed, they can revolt. We don't have to agree with that to understand it, not at all. It can be seen, as I said, everywhere throughout history when people are treated disproportionately and treated unjustly. It can be seen in the prophets of the Old Testament, where they talk about the fact that the poor cannot get justice in the courts of the land. Eventually, something will burst, and then there will be an uprising when you can't take it anymore. Martin Luther King said as much in a speech at Grosse Pointe, Michigan in 1968, as he commented on the urban riots that had been raging throughout the country. He said, "It is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without, at the same time, condemning the continuance of intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel they have no other alternative than to engage in violence and rebellion to get attention. I must say tonight that riots are the language of the unheard." Now, if what I've said in this parable, or whether you will listen to it this way or not, is about the anguish of the powerless to those who are in power and control, the anguish of peasants whose land has been taken and may hope to get it back if they can. Even at Jubilee, after it's over, there may be other ways in which it can be taken back from them. The rich always find a way to get their riches back. But it would mean in this parable that Jesus is taking sides with those who are cheated out of justice. A warning to people in power that those actions can often lead to an uprising. This parable, as Jesus tells it, allows him to speak the truth to the temple elite indirectly by using a layer of insulation in the parable without speaking directly to them. He throws in a parable, and apparently they understood very well because it says that at the end. Following this parable, because Matthew tells us that when the chief priests and the Pharisees heard the parable, they realized he was speaking about them, and they wanted to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. So this was seen not so much as an allegory, but as a prophecy. And the religious leaders understood it, and so did the people. Now, as followers of Jesus, our job is to also read the world, to look at the world that we live in, to hold it a bit up beside the world that God wants, that we can read about in the Gospels, even in the prophets of the Old Testament. A world where the oppressed are not oppressed. A world where there is justice in the courts for the poor as there is for the wealthy. Just that whole thing of discrimination against a person because of color or status. Our world is not to be seen and understood by those who have the power to take it all on the backs of the less fortunate. We are not to see the world as that way and say that's okay. Telling the truth is never divisive. You know, we talk about speaking truth to power. Telling the truth is the only way that unity and harmony and peace can be had, where all men are created, as our founding documents say, equal. Telling the truth is actually loving those who steal and cheat to save their souls. Telling the truth isn't easy. It can cost you your life, as it did Jesus. But because you and I belong to Jesus, we walk with the hope, and we hope we never lose that hope, that God's will can be done. As long as we're on the earth, God's will can be done on this earth, and that we will be part of making it happen. You know, that's what repentance is about. We talk about repenting and be baptized. I don't know what goes through people's mind, but in actuality, here's my definition of repenting. I've been living in the world one way. I see the world a particular way. I will no longer look at the world or the people in the world the way I have been. I will go out from here changed and look at the world through the eyes of Christ and the way God wants us to look at it. I have been convinced in living in a world where the rich and the powerful run the world, and that's the way it should be. I will no longer see the world that way, nor will I live in that kind of world. We can do that as long as we are here. And if that's a call to you, if that's what salvation means to you, then we invite you to come as we stand and sing.